I'm not proud of most of what I've done, but I've gotten used to telling it like it is. No polishing, no excuses, just the version that actually happened. People think crimes are these explosive, chaotic moments. Sometimes they are. But sometimes they start quietly, like a conversation over coffee where both people pretend they're being honest. This one began with a divorce. Mine. Her name doesn't matter. What matters is that by the time we sat down to mutually agree on terms, we were already playing a game neither of us admitted to. She wanted security. I wanted control. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I realized something. Feelings, love, guilt, nostalgia, those weren't obstacles. They were leverage. That was the first crime, if I'm being technical. Not illegal on paper. But it set the tone for everything that followed. We told our friends it was amicable. No shouting, no broken plates, no lawyers sharpening knives in the background. Just two adults. Growing apart. That's the phrase people use when they want to hide something uglier. Truth is, we weren't growing apart, we were calculating distance. And I was better at math than she was. The deal was simple on the surface: split assets, sell the apartment, go our separate ways. But buried in the details were things she cared about more than money: memories, sentimental attachments, the illusion that what we had meant something. I started noticing patterns in what she said, what she hesitated over, what made her voice crack just slightly. That's when I realized I could steer the entire outcome without her ever realizing she'd been steered. I didn't plan the full crime right away. Not yet. At that point, it was just an adjustment. A nudge. A way to make sure I walked away with more than half, without looking like the villain. But the moment I decided to use her feelings against her, that was the moment the line got crossed. Everything after that was just execution. I didn't sit down one night and say, "I'm going to manipulate her." That's not how it works. It creeps in, disguised as strategy, self-defense, fairness, whatever helps you sleep. But looking back, I know exactly when it turned deliberate. I started listening differently. Not to respond. Not to argue. To map her. She kept bringing up the apartment, how we painted the walls together, how the balcony was ours, how leaving it felt like erasing everything. That told me more than any spreadsheet could. She didn't care about the car, barely mentioned savings, and avoided talking about investments entirely. Emotional weight versus financial weight. Clear imbalance. So I began shaping conversations. I'd casually agree with her about the apartment being special, reinforce it, even. I'd bring up small memories, watch her soften, watch her attach more meaning to it than it deserved. Every time she leaned into that sentiment, she leaned away from something else. Meanwhile, I made myself look detached. Reasonable. The guy willing to compromise. I even suggested we avoid lawyers. To keep things peaceful. She liked that idea. Of course she did. That was the real setup. No contracts yet, no signatures. Just quiet positioning. By then, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was designing outcomes. Once I understood what mattered to her, the next step was simple in theory: make her choose the loss herself. That's the trick people don't talk about. If you take something, there's resistance. If they hand it over willingly, they'll defend the decision for you. I started introducing the idea of balance. Not equality, balance. I'd say things like, "You should keep what means the most to you," and let that hang in the air like it was generosity. She interpreted it exactly how I needed her to. The apartment became her thing. Then I quietly reframed everything else as practical. Savings, accounts, long-term investments, those became my domain. Boring, complicated, emotionally neutral. I even downplayed their value sometimes, shrugging like they were just numbers on a screen. She didn't question it much. Why would she? I wasn't pushing, I was agreeing. We built a draft agreement together, sitting side by side, like we were solving a problem as a team. That was the part that still sticks with me. She smiled when we got close to finishing it. And I remember thinking, not whether this was wrong, but whether I could push it just a little further. Once the structure was in place, it came down to details. The kind most people skim over because they're tired, emotional, or just want it to be over. That's where I did the real work. I started inserting small clauses, nothing dramatic. Adjustments to how certain assets were valued, timelines for payments, conditions that sounded fair but leaned in my favor if you actually followed the logic. I never pushed them all at once. I spaced them out, slipped them into different drafts, like background noise. And every time she hesitated, I softened the moment. I'd remind her how smoothly things were going, how we were doing better than most couples. I'd bring up how expensive and ugly it would get if lawyers got involved. That always landed. Fear of conflict is a powerful thing. At one point, she even thanked me for being reasonable. That almost made me stop. Almost. But instead I reassured her, told her I just wanted things to be fair for both of us. And technically, in a very twisted way, I convinced myself it was. By then, the agreement wasn't just tilted. It was engineered. By the time we were close to signing, I wasn't improvising anymore, I was rehearsing. I'd go over every conversation in my head before we had it. Not just what I'd say, but how I'd say it. Tone mattered more than words. Calm, slightly tired, like I just wanted closure. That made her lower her guard. If I sounded too confident, she'd question things. If I sounded too emotional, she'd get defensive. So I stayed in the middle, steady, predictable. I even anticipated her doubts. There were a few clauses I knew might trigger hesitation. So I prepared explanations in advance, simple ones, easy to follow, just logical enough to feel solid. I practiced saying them out loud when I was alone, adjusting phrasing until it sounded natural, almost casual. What I didn't expect was how normal it started to feel. At some point, it stopped feeling like manipulation and started feeling like problem solving. Like I was just being efficient, cutting through unnecessary complications. That's probably the most dangerous part. When you stop seeing the line, you stop worrying about crossing it. And by then, I wasn't anywhere near it anymore. The day we signed, it didn't feel dramatic. No tension in the air, no sense of finality like you see in movies. It was just quiet. Almost boring. We met at the apartment, her choice, of course. Papers spread across the kitchen table we'd picked out years ago. She made coffee out of habit, like this was just another Sunday morning. That routine made it easier for her. Familiarity can blur reality in a dangerous way. I kept everything light. Small talk, neutral topics, nothing that would spike emotion too early. The goal was to ease into it, make the act of signing feel like a natural continuation of everything we'd already agreed on. When we finally got to the documents, I walked her through them, not too slowly, not too fast. Just enough guidance to keep momentum without raising suspicion. Every time she paused, I gently reinforced the idea that we'd already discussed this, that nothing here was new. She nodded a lot. That's what I remember most. Not hesitation. Not doubt. Just quiet agreement, over and over again, like she was convincing herself as much as she was agreeing with me. There's always a moment. People think it's the signing itself, the ink hitting paper, but that's just a formality. The real moment happens a few seconds earlier, when the decision becomes irreversible in their mind. I saw it happen to her. She was halfway through the last page, eyes scanning but not really reading anymore. You can tell when someone's switched from analyzing to finishing. That mental shift, let's just get this done, that's where everything collapses into inevitability. Her hand hovered for a second. Not long. Just enough to register that something inside her was checking for doubt. And I almost said something. Not to stop her, just to ease that pause, smooth it over. But I didn't need to. She exhaled, like she was letting go of something heavy, and signed. That was it. No dramatic music, no realization. Just a pen sliding across paper. I signed right after, matching her pace, like we were still in sync. We even stacked the papers neatly together when we were done. That detail sticks with me. Like we just completed something clean. Something mutual. Something fair. Which, of course, it wasn't. Right after we finished, there was this strange calm. Not relief exactly, more like the absence of tension. The kind that fills a room when something important is over but hasn't fully sunk in yet. She smiled at me. Not a big smile. Just a small, tired one. The kind people give when they believe they handled something difficult the right way. I returned it automatically. That part didn't even feel fake. We talked for a bit after, about logistics, timelines, when she'd move out, how we'd handle the handover. It all sounded so reasonable, so structured. Like we were still partners, just reorganizing our lives instead of ending them. Then she said something I didn't expect. "Thank you for not making this harder than it had to be." That line stayed with me. Because in her mind, I'd made things easier. Cleaner. Kinder. And in a way, that was true. There were no fights, no legal battles, no drawn-out bitterness. Just a quiet agreement. Carefully shaped. I left the apartment not feeling like I'd won, but like I'd completed something. Efficiently. And that should have bothered me more than it did. For a few days, everything held together exactly the way I expected. We followed the plan, kept communication minimal, stuck to logistics. No drama, no second thoughts, at least, none she showed. But cracks don't start loud. They show up in small shifts. She began asking questions. Nothing direct at first, just clarifications. Why certain numbers were calculated the way they were. Why timelines leaned the way they did. The kind of questions you ask when you finally have space to think without someone guiding you. I kept my answers consistent. Calm, patient, slightly reassuring. I reminded her we'd already gone over these points, that everything was aligned with what we agreed. And for a while that worked. But then her tone changed. Less certain. Less trusting. She stopped saying, "we," and started saying, "you." That's when I knew something had clicked for her, not fully, not yet, but enough to create doubt. And doubt is dangerous. Not because it proves anything, but because once it starts, it doesn't need much to grow. I told myself I could manage it. Keep things contained. At that point, I still believed I was in control. It escalated faster than I expected. She called me one evening, no small talk this time, no soft entry into the conversation. Just straight to it. "Did you know this was uneven when we signed it?" That word, uneven, it was careful. Not unfair. Not manipulated. She wasn't accusing me yet. She was testing the ground, seeing how I'd respond. I didn't answer immediately. Silence can be useful, but only in small doses. Too long, and it turns into suspicion. So I exhaled, kept my voice steady, almost confused. "What do you mean?" That bought me time. Made her explain, made her expose exactly what she'd noticed. She pointed out a couple of clauses, nothing major on their own, but together they started to form a pattern. That was the risk I'd calculated. Patterns. I reassured her again, reframed everything as perspective. Told her it only looked uneven because she was focusing on specific parts instead of the whole. She didn't push as hard as I expected. But she didn't back down either. And when the call ended, I realized something uncomfortable. She wasn't convinced anymore. Not fully. And that meant the situation wasn't finished. After that call, everything became about containment. I couldn't undo what was signed, but I could still shape how she interpreted it. If she framed it as a misunderstanding, I was safe. If she framed it as deception, things could get complicated, legally, emotionally, socially. So I doubled down on consistency. Every message I sent, every response, every explanation, it all had to align perfectly with the version of events I had been presenting from the start. No contradictions, no over-explaining. Just steady, reasonable logic. She kept reaching out over the next few days, Short messages, sharper than before. Less emotion, more focus. That worried me more than anger would have. Anger burns out. Focus builds. At one point, she mentioned showing the agreement to someone. That hit harder than I expected. Because once a third party steps in, the story changes. It's no longer about feelings, it becomes analysis. I responded carefully. Not defensive, not dismissive. Just suggested that anyone unfamiliar with our situation might misinterpret things. Which was true. Just not in the way I meant it. Still, I could feel control slipping, not all at once, but in small, measurable ways. And there wasn't a clean fix for that. She told me a few days later that she'd spoken to a lawyer. Not hired one, spoken to one. The distinction mattered, at least at first. It meant she was still exploring, still uncertain, still not fully committed to turning this into a conflict. But it also meant the agreement was no longer just ours. Someone else had looked at it without context, without emotion, without history. Just structure, numbers, implications. That's where things start to unravel. She didn't accuse me outright. Instead, she relayed what he'd said in fragments, phrases like imbalanced considerations, unclear valuation methods, potentially contestable. Clinical language. Detached. Dangerous. I responded the same way I had before, calm, measured, consistent. I reminded her that we both agreed freely, that nothing had been hidden, that everything was transparent. And technically, that wasn't a lie. Everything was there. I just knew how she'd read it. There was a pause in our conversation after that. Longer than usual. Then she said, "I trusted you to explain it honestly." That one landed. Because it cut past the document. Straight into intent. That sentence stayed with me longer than anything else she said. Not the legal terms, not the implied threat of contesting the agreement, just that one line about trust. Because it shifted the whole situation out of strategy and into something harder to manage. Intent is messy. You can argue facts, defend structure, point to signatures. But intent? That lives in how things felt to the other person. And once someone decides you acted in bad faith, every detail starts bending to support that belief. Our conversations changed after that. She stopped asking questions and started making statements. Not loud, not emotional, just firm. She believed something had been done to her, not with her. I tried to hold the line, keep everything grounded in logic. Reminded her that we both had agency, that she had time to review everything, that nothing was forced. And again, that was true. But truth, I was learning, isn't always enough. Because she wasn't arguing about what happened on paper anymore. She was arguing about what happened between the lines. And that's exactly where I'd done my work. It didn't explode into a courtroom battle like you'd expect. No dramatic reversal, no last-minute justice. That's not how it ended. She didn't contest the agreement. That surprised me more than anything. After everything, the doubts, the lawyer, the shift in her tone, I expected escalation. But instead, she pulled back. Communication slowed, then almost disappeared. The process moved forward exactly as outlined. On paper, I got what I wanted. More than half. Control. Clean separation. But something changed in the way it all settled. The last time I saw her in person, there was no anger left. No accusation, no attempt to reopen anything. Just distance. The kind that isn't about space, but about conclusion. She looked at me like she'd already filed everything away. Not legally. Personally. That's when it hit in a way it hadn't before. I hadn't just ended a relationship or negotiated a deal. I'd rewritten how I existed in someone else's memory. And there's no clause for that. No way to rebalance it later. That part stays exactly as it is. So yeah, I got away with it. No court. No charges. No one forcing me to undo anything. If you measure it purely by outcome, it was clean, efficient, successful. That's the version I told myself at first. But success depends on what you're counting. I didn't break a law. Not really. I stayed within the lines, just leaned on them harder than most people would. Use timing, tone, emotion. Nothing you can point to and say, there, that's the crime. And maybe that's the problem. Because it leaves you with something harder to process. There's no punishment to react against, no external consequence to make sense of what you did. Just your own interpretation. Do I regret it? Not in the simple way people expect. I don't wake up wishing I'd walked away with less. But I do understand something now I didn't then. If you start treating people like variables, you'll eventually reduce yourself the same way. So if anyone reading this is in a clean, mutual situation like I was, just ask yourself one thing. Are you solving a problem? Or are you quietly becoming one?